We have three remarkable women who've been working on water for quite a few years, and a superb gentleman from Montana who's going to keep them all in line, so we have lots of good discussion. But we are really grateful to these women, I will be brief, for what they've been thinking about doing, acting on water. So Dan Spencer, take it away. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dan Spencer. I'm here from Montana, and I want to start our panel simply by invoking the sacramentality of water and welcoming water to this panel as well. So, in Montana and the Rocky Mountain West, water has been a central issue for well over a century. Mark Twain was reported to have quipped over a century ago that in the West, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. And unfortunately, that's becoming a global reality, as one of our panelists has written about in her book, Just Water, Ethics, Water, and the Global Crisis. But what we're going to see here in this panel, I think, is, or listen to, that water is many, many more things than simply for fighting. Water is living water. Water is the agent of life. Water is lover, dissolving boundaries. Water is justice, bringing us knowledge of injustices and inequity. Water is friend, indwelling in intimacy. Water is porosity, as grounding for theopoetics. And as I've really found as I move into my middle years here, and past my middle years, water as teacher of humility. I can no longer make it through the night without having to get up to pee, often several times. Sometimes I don't even make it through an 80-minute class, and so I apologize to my students and dash down the hallway. So water is a teacher of many things about our embodiedness and how we relate to each other and to the planet. Our first speaker here is Christiana Peppard, who teaches at Fordham, but she is a daughter of Yale as well, where she did her graduate work. She's going to be speaking to us on water agency, rights, and theopoetics. And Christiana is the author of many writings, but as I mentioned before, a book called Just Water, Theology, Ethics, and the Global Water Crisis.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of you lovely bodies of water for coming here. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. So I come to this topic through a range of different lenses. One is as a teacher of undergraduates and graduate students in classes ranging from environmental ethics to religion and science. I come, as Dan mentioned, as the author of a book on how to think about water as an ethical issue in the current era of scarcity and economic globalization. And I also came as a student who took a class with Mary Evelyn and John while doing my doctoral work here at Yale. So it's a pleasure to be here in all of those guises. And what I'm going to talk about today, succinctly, I hope, in three parts is an adventure into some ways that we might think about water, simply not exhaustive, but hopefully evocative. The first is water as agent in geology and in anthropology, or how we understand ourselves. The second is looking a little bit at what's going on with regard to fresh water as a human right and water in 21st century rights discourse. And then the third is a little more suggestive, also subjective, that is water in emerging theopoetics. So, part one, water as agent in geology and anthropology. Before there was life, there was water. Helen Keller has written well and evocatively about the Tahomic paradox and the ways in which water and chaos intersect and give rise eventually to life. For hundreds of millions of years, as we know, the flux and challenge of elemental life was punctuated by periods of mass extinction. We're now in the sixth, human-caused, and forced beings to adapt or disappear entirely. And so it's no accident that water, part of this matrix, has been noted by thinkers from Paracelsus to Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry. And the latter two, in their book, The Universe Story, humorously anthropomorphize how, after eons of watery habitation, the first creatures to venture onto land were plants. So in present-day human and ecological contexts, specific regional titrations of fresh water and salt water make the earth livable, and our societies hum with various kinds of productivity. As someone who was born in the Central Valley in California, I grew up in Colorado, and now finds myself in New York, I'm often well aware of how the hydrographies of certain kinds of places shape our understandings of what kind of value water has. There was also a term mentioned in the last session, Anthropocene. This may be familiar to some of you and not to others. It's a term that was coined in 2000 by Nobel laureate atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen and his colleague Eugene Stormer, and it signifies, it's intended to signify within the language of the geological timescale the recent period in which humans, especially industrialized humanity, have exercised an outsized impact on Earth systems. One of the ones that has been put forward as particularly vulnerable is freshwater scarcity, freshwater distribution for ecological contexts as well as humans. And I think that one of the really rich suggestions made by the neologism of the Anthropocene is that this is not just a scientific or planetary way of speaking about material reality. It also has ontological and ethical implications. For we, these evolutionary latecomers to the geological planetary party, are playing fast and loose with the Earth's sediments and processes. And how do we think of ethics in that light? I think that's a lot of what 21st century religious ethics needs to be about. So, part 2, 21st century water rights discourse and environmental ethics. Environmental ethicists, of course, have long been keen to demonstrate how humans are fundamentally implicated in environmental processes. And so concepts such as earth, biotic community, interdependence, etc., have been key words in environmental ethics, especially religious environmental ethics and ecofeminism: interdependence, relatedness, embeddedness, porosity. We're networked, we're situated, we're contingent, we're dependent, not merely on our smartphones or other digital devices, but also on the biotic and planetary and geophysical realities that support our life, of which water is one of the most vital molecules around. And then, to quote theologian Paula Cooey, we come into the world in the middle of things to which we are indebted, things not of our own making, for whose repair we nonetheless become responsible. We are the agential, reflexive species. She continues, we die in the middle of things, leaving the legacy of our shared yet unique presence, including the effects of our mistakes to strangers we will never know. And in some of my work in the book Just Water, I talk about different inflections of this observation with regard to, say, industrial agriculture, the various hydraulic engineering projects, both in the 20th century, especially in the U.S. West, and in present-day places like China, where Three Gorges Dam, other ways of, to quote one expert, moving the waters around, has been a form of human dominance over certain kinds of earth systems. So, how water is understood to be, whether it is a simple molecule, H2O, whether it is primarily an economic commodity, whether it is an important part of ecosystem function, whether it is fundamentally a riparian good or something that can be owned, sold, something to which people or other biotic forms of life have a right. Those paradigms of ontology and value will be very consequential for how water is understood to flow or not to flow in the coming centuries. And social theorist Jamie Linton, who works up in British Columbia, puts it this way. What's at stake is the choice of how something like water is taken to be and what kinds of relations it is allowed to sustain. So what kind of thing is water? And many of you who follow water in some way or just follow the news in some way probably noticed that in late May and early June 2014, there was a big hullabaloo in Detroit over who had access to water and on what terms. This is a certain kind of I guess we can call it a spasm, of an anxiety that's been besetting global justice communities and water wonks for about 2 decades, and it's the question of whether water is best understood primarily as an economic commodity from which economic value and profit can be derived, or whether it is a human right that is a fundamental entitlement due to all persons, regardless of ability to pay. There's a lot to say on this. My work within religious studies and theology focuses on Catholic social teaching, and what I simply want to point out here is that the Catholic Church, believe it or not, strongly advocates for the fundamental human right to water, did so well before 2010 when the UN codified the formal human right to water, and actually some papal documents refer to fresh water not just as a human right, but as a right to life issue. So I say right to life issue in the US context, and I'm guessing you don't think of toilets or taps or sanitation or clean water infrastructure, right? You think about what we may call pelvic issues. So I think it would be healthy, generally, if we were to associate the right to life with a human right of access to clean, fresh water and sanitation. And I say this for many reasons, including that I'm a feminist, and there are differential burdens of water placed on gendered bodies worldwide. Women, children bear the brunt. Ecofeminism here has a great deal to say and has been really illuminating about some of these unjust structures and patterns. So human rights matters, a gender lens matters, but whose rights and to what kind of life? The environmentalist in me presses to expand the sphere of moral considerability. Does the river itself have a right to exist? Does water itself, however we understand that complex materiality, whether we assign it subjectivity, whether we define it in terms of volumetric quantities, is there some kind of right for water to exist, undammed, unsullied? I don't know. But Barry Lopez evokes the question well when he writes in one of his pieces, "The river said in the middle of all of this silence that there had to be an agreement. No one could just do something, do whatever they wanted. You couldn't just take someone for granted." One place to look if you're interested in this kind of exploration is in the 2010 document, the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which was put forward by the World People's Conference on Climate Change, and it's a broad-based attempt to provide an alternative rights paradigm to the Western anthropocentric human rights framework that has been critiqued from a range of different quarters. But the question for us is, to what degree is rights language the best language to use for talking about ethics and water ethics? And that's open. It's very much open, at least for the next 2 minutes in which I will finish this talk. All right, so part 3. This is theopoetics and how Journey of the Universe, all of this relates to water and to ethics and to my work. I'll just cut to the chase and say that in my view, one of the great strengths of cosmological discourse, of which Journey of the Universe is indicative, is that it can destabilize our assumptions and ethical anthropocentrism, while also acknowledging the inevitability of our human ways of knowing through science, through literature, through received cultural traditions. I want to signal in particular the work of 2 scholars at the conference who really navigate the complexities of narrating the universe story and what that means for ethics and eco-justice. That's Whitney Bauman and Willis Jenkins. They both published great books this year. You should buy them. As well as Mary Evelyn and John's Religion and Ecology volume, and the, of course, Journey of the Universe book. But I want to conclude by saying that I think Journey of the Universe is perhaps counterintuitively theological. Now, granted, it's not explicitly God talk, but it talks about telos, about the process of unfolding towards some kind of goal, perhaps with some kind of intentionality. And human experience in this evolving, changing planet is grounded, as it is in our daily lives, in touchstones of particularity. Referring to the film, we've got this particular island of Samos, this ripe tomato, this view of the moon on this particular night. Or, as the epigraph, it's a Borges epigraph to Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, As that epigraph puts it, centuries upon centuries, and only in the present do things happen. I'll conclude simply by saying that theopoetics, evolutionary stories, they're vital. They're moments of conversion. They're moments of expansion of our consciousness. They're not necessarily ethical unless we make them so, unless we take on the imperative to action ourselves in whatever scales and by whatever forms of agency we find. And in particular, unless they interrupt systems of exploitation that are endemic to our era of economic globalization. Unless they interrupt the disavowals that are caused by global patterns of power and privilege and profit. So, evocation is important, but as far as ethics is concerned, it's just the beginning. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christy. As an ethicist, that was a wonderful concluding note. I share your ethical passions on that. Our second speaker is Elizabeth McAnally, who is doing doctoral work at the California Institute of Integral Studies, but has been deeply connected to the Forum on Religion and Ecology, working on both the newsletter and the website. And her paper is titled Loving Water, Loving God.
It's a really wonderful honor to be here with you all. And to begin, I would just like to invoke my favorite line from Mary Oliver in her poem Spring. There's only one question: how to love this world. Okay, and so what I want to talk about in these brief moments is how to love this world by loving water, which can also help us to love God. Okay, so just to sit with that, I'd like to contextualize by saying Thomas Berry. Yes, and I never got to meet Thomas face to face, but I do feel his presence daily whenever I drink from a special bowl that was created for Thomas's memorial service at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Some of you might have this same bowl. It's part of 108 different bowls that form a water mala. Mala is the Sanskrit word for prayer beads. And so this water mala ceremony is based on a Buddhist ceremony, a Buddhist ritual that says, treat water as a living being and pay attention to this sacred source of life. And so I've taken this to heart, and as I'm writing my dissertation on cultivating intimate relationships with water, before I sit down to write every day, I pick up this special bowl of water and I hold it in silence, and I gaze at the water, and I try to open my heart and listen to water's messages. And then I say some prayers of gratitude, drink the water, refill it from the tap, put it back on my altar, and then go about writing. And this has been really important for me because it's helped me to really try to understand what it means to live in a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, as Thomas said so beautifully. What does it mean to treat water as a person? Okay? And I really feel that by cultivating a more intimate relationship with water, this helps us to cultivate a more intimate relationship with all things in the universe. So you can do this with anything. My favorite is water. I love water so much. And for you, it might be seeds, or it might be mountains, or it might be your child, or anything. By loving any one thing as much as you can learn to open your heart to the whole world. And you can learn how to love God by doing so. And I just want to say that this practice of treating water as a person, I feel that it's really inspired from my upbringing in an evangelical Southern Baptist home, where I was taught that it's really important to cultivate a personal relationship with the living water of Jesus Christ. And so now doing this with water in a Buddhist pagan context, but remembering this living water of Christ, it's been really, really important for me. And so just thinking about how Jesus called himself the living water, and whoever drinks of this living water will never be thirsty again, but will have eternal life. This is so important for us. And I feel that this focus on eternal life as an otherworldly concern for many Christians, this can lead to problems in how to treat the world. How do we love this world if it's just a temporary home that we're passing through? How do we do that, and what does it mean? Well, I feel that it's so important for groups like the Evangelical Environmental Network to emphasize care of creation. And I feel that Journey of the Universe really helps to contribute to this conversation, because Journey shows that this natural world is not just a mere background for the human adventure, but it's an integral part of us as humans, of all beings who are the cosmos. And so by situating the human endeavor in this cosmic evolutionary process, we can see that the stuff of our bodies, the watery material of our bodies is shared in common with the water of all life on Earth. And how special is that? How special is it that the stars are our ancestors? Like, how water is one of our oldest living relatives. A brand new study from the journal Science has shown that 30 to 50% of the water on Earth is older than the solar system that we live in. It is over 4.6 billion years old. That's old. And isn't that amazing that it's still around, that we are water, that we can drink water, that we can bathe in this ancient cosmic relative? Isn't it amazing? And so I feel that what I really would like to invoke in this time is how to love water, how to love this world, how to love God. And I really feel that this is right in line with this whole concept of we're living in a communion of subjects. We're living in a living universe. There's interiority present throughout from the beginning. And St. Francis of Assisi, he called water sister water, so useful, humble, precious, and pure. And Thomas Berry says, the primary sacred community is the universe. And so when we look at the world, we can look at the world as our family, as our relatives. We can learn how to love. And we know from the Christian tradition that love is at the core of Christianity. Jesus said, love God. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love even your enemies. Love is also at the core of the new story of the universe. There's my favorite part in the book, Journey of the Universe, happens to be about water, and it's a section called Intimacy and the Oceans. And in this part, this little section, I think it captures the whole essence of this universe. In this section, it says that we humans are at a very unique point in the evolution of the cosmos, because we have the capacity to develop comprehensive compassion for all beings in the universe. We're the first species in the history of Earth that is capable of caring for the entire Earth. And what the book goes on to say is that the oceans teach us how to do this. That we humans are ocean-like in our ability to have empathetic love. Water teaches us how to love and how to dissolve boundaries and flow into the feelings of another. And so at this juncture in cosmic evolution, we humans have the opportunity to step into our cosmic role and become the heart and mind of the cosmos. Isn't that awesome? We have the ability to learn to love everything in the universe, our friends and our enemies. And so like Christ, water can be our teacher. Water can be our guide. And we can learn how to love and how to be compassionate by paying attention to water as a manifestation of Christ. And so both Christianity and the journey of the universe teach us to see water as a gift from God, a gift from the cosmos. And water has a very unique role in this evolution of the cosmos. You know, water, as we all know, it's a vital part of every living being on Earth. It's this elemental link that connects all of life. It's found in cells, in the bodies of individuals, in the great hydrosphere of the Earth, of water Gaia. It's found throughout the cosmos. You know, you have ice on comets and asteroids. You have oceans on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. You have great clouds of water vapor surrounding black holes. Water is everywhere. And it's just so important for us to take into account this deep history, this deep time of water, because it can help us to see our connection with the cosmos. And so by learning to open our hearts to water, we can learn to open up our hearts to all beings and to God. And so what would it look like to love water? That's a huge question for me. And I think, for one, it means that we cannot continue treating water as a commodity. We can't treat water as a mere resource for humans to profit from. We cannot pollute water. We have to make sure that water is continually pure and healthy, vibrant, able to support all of life. And so this means like caring for the least of these, as Jesus said. The least of these includes water in the form of, this liquid, in the form of water bodies of the humans and the more than human world. And so if the waters of our rituals are polluted, what does that say about our relationship to God? I think that it would say that something is wrong and we need to get right. We need to start remembering this connection that we have to all of life on Earth, to cosmogenesis, and so what better way to love others than to learn to love all of the waters of the world? So just to conclude, I want to just say that the possibility of remembering our connection with this living universe, it's right here, and we can ask water to help us remember. So Jesus said, drink in remembrance of me. So when we drink water with every sip, let's try to remember the living water. And when we bathe, let's remember the life-renewing gift of baptism. And when we come into contact or see water, let's just be inspired to love and care for all beings. And I just invite us all to take time daily to remember and to renew our relationship to water, to the universe, to God, and to give gratitude for our place here in this sacred living universe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's a wonderful segue of loving water, living water, to our final panel presentation. Nancy Wright's paper is actually talked on titled Living Water. But I have to add a footnote here. It's a particular joy and privilege for me to be on this panel with Nancy. 32 years ago, Nancy was my field site supervisor and spiritual mentor when I was a seminarian in New York City, and we worked together in the West Side Ecumenical Ministry to the Elderly. Since that time, she has deepened her ministry through time in the Earth Ministry and now as pastor of Ascension Lutheran Church. But I'm really, really delighted to welcome you to the panel, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Dan and all of you. It's a great privilege to be here. And Mary Evelyn and John, who've given me and others of us so many incredible opportunities through the decades. A quote from the Book of Enoch. And in that place I saw the fountain of righteousness, which was inexhaustible. And around it were many fountains of wisdom, and all the thirsty drank of them, and were filled with wisdom. And their dwellings were with the righteous and holy, and elect. So if we can picture all of us thirsty and drinking from fountains that give us wisdom, and if we can do that, that is receiving living water. So 2 years ago, I was on a sabbatical, a Lilly Endowment-funded sabbatical focused on living water, and I went to Scotland and the Holy Land and Alaska. And I was very thirsty for living water. I serve a parish, as Dan said, where I try to preach about climate change and the environment, and I seem to end up splitting people in the congregation. Some people felt that I was too focused on the environmental issue and therefore was not doing enough either pastoral visitation or enough teaching Sunday school, and others were drawn to the church because of the social justice and the environmental issues. So I felt drained and scattered. And I went to Iona. Iona, many of you have been to the island there and stayed in a bed and breakfast, and the sign in the dining room said, "To reach the heart of Iona is to find something eternal, fresh visions and new courage for every place where love or duty or pain may call us." And I thought, this is exactly where I need to be, in this natural area, this island overlooking the sea, where, as you know, St. Columba landed in about the year 563. And he set off, for reasons unknown, landed in Iona. He sailed in a leather-bound boat, and he just let the sea take him. And he landed on what is now known as Columba's Bay. And if you go to Iona, to this island off the coast of Scotland, you will have the opportunity to take a pilgrimage all day. You walk around the island, and there are places on the island where you stop with the other pilgrims and read and think. And at St. Columba's Bay, where he landed, you can take a stone and throw it in the water, into the ocean, throwing away what you don't want to have anymore. And I threw away the anxieties I had about my church and all the other anxieties I had, and picked up another stone and walked away with it, trying to reclaim a sense of hope. So 3 blessings from the sabbatical that I would like to mention very briefly. The first is a realization about the history of water and the 13.6 or 8 billion year universe. The Journey of the Universe, the movie, was produced about the same time that I was beginning the sabbatical. And truly, I confess, until that time, I had not ever thought about the history of water. I had never asked myself, where does water come from? How old is water? Amazing. With a new sense of wonder, I realized by watching the movie, and I'm not particularly scientific, trying to realize and picture the Big Bang creating hydrogen, and then hydrogen reformulating into oxygen. And way before the Earth and the solar system, the H2O molecule combining. And as Elizabeth said, and then for the first time just a few years ago, picturing the water in space and the ice-coated planetesimals. And then water on all the sun's planets. Believe it or not, until about 3 years ago, I thought that Earth was the only place that water ever was. I hate to confess this. Water was on all of our planets with different fates. And as we know, then water and steam and rain fell on the Earth. And we know then, and it's easier to picture how the water collected on the Earth and cellular life developed. So the first blessing in the past 2 or 3 years is realizing and understanding and trying to grasp the immensity of the universe. The second blessing, living water. I needed bathing in living water. I wanted to drink living water, and I didn't know how to get that. I was drawn by the story in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, about Jesus. We've referred to that, talking to a Samaritan woman at the well about living water. On a hot day, she is at the well in the middle of the day, And Jesus comes up and talks to her when men didn't talk to women and Jews did not talk to Samaritans. But here he is in the Gospel of John. And Jesus asks her for a drink. And she's perplexed and astonished. And she asks, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Jesus answers, if you knew who is asking you for a drink, you would ask him for living water welling up to eternal life. Well, she asks Jesus how he can draw, how he finds this living water, because unlike her, he has no bucket, and this well is deep. And then a famous theological conversation ensues between Jesus and the woman about living water. I went from Iona, and I went to the Holy Land and bathed in the Jordan River. Difficult to receive the Jordan River as living water because it is so contested. And because there is so much environmental injustice around that river. And still, I felt renewed by bathing in it and was perplexed by that feeling. And reading to prepare for this paper, I understood how the early Christians, as has been mentioned earlier today, said little or no blessing over water prior to baptism because water was the blessing. And as the hierarchy of the church developed and we became less familiar with running, living water, the blessings added more and more words. The understanding in the early church that water itself is the blessing is reflected in an Orthodox church father, Cyril of Jerusalem, who wrote in the 4th century, "Why has he, Christ, called the grace of the Spirit by the name of water? Because by water all things subsist. For one fountain watered the whole of the garden, and one and the same rain comes down upon all the world, yet it becomes white in the lily and red in the rose, adapting itself to the nature of each thing which receives it. It becomes to each what is suitable." Back to the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. The woman said to Jesus what I felt, "Give me this water, so I never have to draw again." And she reminds us of the millions of women and girls around the world through the ages who have drawn water needed for their families, and the great, terrible weight of water disfiguring sometimes their bone structures. Well, Jesus then asks her to call her husband. And he seems to know that she has had 5 husbands and the one she's with is not her husband. And because of that, and why that's included in the Gospel of John, I think is fantastic. She says to him, you told me everything I've ever done. And she drops her water bucket and she becomes a leader. To me, she becomes the first minister, the first evangelist. She runs back to her village and says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Can he be the Messiah?" Like a good preacher, she asks a question of her townspeople, and the townspeople then come out to meet Jesus. So it seems that the effect of a relationship to Jesus Christ, combined with the wonder elicited by the cosmic history of water, can both and together open our eyes and our hearts to the marvelous nature of water and also to a new creative sense of our own identity. The woman at the well found a new identity. Receiving living water can enable us to become leaders who proclaim the gift of water and help to empower women around the world. And to conclude, the third blessing is a reflection that has come from this sabbatical period on union with water or marriage with water. For the picture of the Samaritan woman at the well talking to Jesus parallels the marriage between Rebekah and Isaac, who also met at a well, according to Genesis 24. Thus, two couples at a well, signaling and prefiguring our marriage with water, or marriage between the scientific story of water and its spiritual meaning. We remember that when Helen Keller recognized water, her whole perception of life and of herself awakened. She wrote, "We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought. And somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that water meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. The living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. I saw everything with the strange new sight that had come to me." How are we all Helen Kellers? How are we blind and inarticulate about water and need to see and speak? How can water help us understand ourselves and the universe? During each sabbatical day, I washed my face slowly, prayerfully, grateful for water. And I finished my journey with a contemplative retreat, days of silent kayaking in Alaska with Kurt Holting, who directs a program called Inside Passages. Kayaking hour after hour in silence, Kurt encouraged us to simply notice. I noticed ripples from raindrops radiating out in concentric circles, all connecting, overlapping, and mesmerizing me in the spell of water. My congregation also participated in the sabbatical, cleaning up Bartlett Brook behind our church in Burlington, Vermont, where farmers had put down whole washing machines and all kinds of things in the stream. And we took up a special collection for Lutheran World Relief, which funds water projects for women, especially helping women around the world. The sabbatical enhanced my contemplative gaze and heart, which Thomas Berry, whom I was fortunate to see and hear many times, which he always had. Such a gaze is made possible by an interior freedom, by prayer. The world is full of radiance of the love of Christ. Through this incarnated mystery brought to life through living water, we can celebrate the universe and give thanks for the chance to contemplate who we are as beings, water beings, who evangelize, tell the great news of the miracle of water, life's physical and spiritual matrix. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. I think we have some time for questions and comments here. 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay, we got some microphones available for people to see. Barbara Rossing has her hand up front here.
Thank you to all of you. My question is to Christiana. The distinction between water as a right or water as a commodity, to a layperson's hearing, sounds like the question of whether it's going to be free, right, free of charge, or whether it will be something that you pay for. And it seems like that's the trickiest issue. I'm a biblical scholar. I cannot think of a single passage in the Bible where anyone has to pay money for water. In fact, in the book of Revelation, in chapters 21 and 22, it's underscored. It's dorian, is the Greek word, free of charge, also could be translated as priceless. And there's a place in Lamentations where the lament is we have to pay for our water. But what do you do then in all the questions around the world today about water privatization in order to have a delivery system? Because that's where infrastructure is the issue. Do you have guidance on that? And then my second question, it seems like we're coming around to the economy over and over with all these panels, but how then would you transition to something like what you're talking about, given that water laws in the U.S. almost means the exact opposite? I mean, I happen to own senior water rights, and it doesn't mean that it's a right for everyone to have water as a human right. It means I get water allocation for irrigation no matter what. I mean, so it's the way U.S. water law is kind of the opposite of what we need to move towards. So, but the first question especially, so the economic question, what do you do if something's very precious? Does it mean you shouldn't charge at all for it, or what those issues of commodity and rights?
Thanks, Barbara. That's a great question. First of all, two things that you introduced me to. One, that Lamentations passage, which I'll follow up with you about. But also, I've never met a senior water rights owner face to face. Do you live in California? Washington. Okay, that's a big deal. So for people who follow drought in California and the West, it's like royalty in the American West. Okay, anyway. So the language of property rights and the implicit contrast between a property right where one is entitled to own and then implicitly do almost whatever one wants with that water, versus the language of universal human rights as a form of universal moral entitlements due to people regardless of ability to pay. I mean, there is a problematic conflation of language. Part of what I write about in some of my work is how in an era of economic globalization, when we talk, we being the normative, hegemonic, Western, white we who runs the banks, when we talk about value, it's often through the language of price or the representational system of market economies. But as many philosophers are at great pains to point out, some with few words, some with many, price is not a sufficient category for thinking about value. And I think this is part of why the rights versus commodity debate has reached such fever pitch as a species of broader objections to economic globalization as a form of neocolonialism. There are lots of indigenous traditions around the world, Vandana Shiva writes about some of them, where one should never be asked to pay for water, and in fact, giving someone a glass of water is the fundamental sign of respect and hospitality. When I was on a research trip in the Kingdom of Jordan in 2008, we met with the water minister there who lamented the fact that he was having a hard time getting people to pay for water infrastructure because of this idea that water is a gift from God and therefore a right. And that cuts up then against the reality that you presented in your second part of the question, which is, it does cost money. It requires capital to invest in infrastructure. And especially when that infrastructure is subterranean, when we have been accustomed to paying so little for fresh water that flows out of our taps in the developed world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's a real adjustment to think of incorporating what some people call the actual value or institutionalized value of water. So there does need to be some way to pay for water infrastructure, in some cases for water extraction, certainly for sanitation and purification. But as an ethicist, the questions for me are, well, who pays, who benefits, and who bears the burdens? And are those distributions just or unjust? And is water the kind of thing that ought to be profited from, ultimately? Thanks.
Yeah, you mentioned China, and my ears perked up. You might be interested to know, Elizabeth, that the Taoists, among many things that they do well, they have the water cycle as the metaphor for this form of meditation called internal alchemy. And this is the water cycle unites mind, body, and divinization. So that might be something that would interest you. Christiana, I wonder if you could comment on something a scholar of Taoism and sustainability, James Miller, wrote in a recent post, a couple of months ago, that China is actually the model country for sustainability, because it's not a question for them that the environment is a crisis. And that he uses water as an example. They have 20% of the world's population and only 7% of the world's water.
One more question, and then the panel can address.
Thank you so much for this triple aqua theopoetics. I'm just wondering if it might be helpful, since there was so much zooming in. Would it be helpful, since there was so much zooming in on John chapter 3, to note that, Elizabeth's problem is very real, with eternal life endangering our springing right out of everything we want to gain from the materialization of water there. To then go back to the translation, right? The original, actually, to be translated Greek is Zoe Ionios, and that ancient meaning of Ionios has nothing to do with what we have come to mean by eternal, a kind of abstract, self-identical timelessness, right? It really means of the ages. So Jesus is offering the life of the ages, which actually sounds very close to how Elizabeth was defining water as all the life of the earth, or the oldest living relative, and it'll be the longest living one for us if we live long. Thought that might be a helpful hermeneutical bit.
Thank you.
So Dan, perhaps every panelist would take 1 minute and 15.5 seconds.
All right. Start now.
Ready, set, go. I used to be a competitive swimmer, of course, so water. So let's see how fast I can do this. I will do it languorously, and that's to say that I think if you look at John 4, since this is a conference on Christian responses to the journey of the universe, if you look at John 4, and you look at the history of interpretation of the woman at the well, you can see various kinds of evolution of hermeneutical principles as well as awareness of context, the use of language, as Catherine was rightly pointing out. And Nancy and I have been in a series of email exchanges about the Jordan River and its significations, and about the concept of living water versus, well water. This is going to sound like a shameless plug for my book, sorry. But the last chapter is on this idea of living water, which actually in some of the original language is flowing water, and which Augustine, as an interpreter, understands as water that is taken flowing from the source, not water that is held in a cistern or well or other stagnant site, which in the ancient world would have been more likely, the former, the flowing water, would have been more likely to be healthy and life-giving. So there are layers upon layers of the ways in which we can read this passage, and also read different kinds of Christian consciousness about the principles that guide interpretation and application.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you for that. I just wanted to contribute just a tiny bit about what Christiana was saying about stagnant water versus water flowing, and just to bring up the work of Ivan Illich in his book H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness. He talks about the importance of remembering the archetypal significance of water, and seeing water not just as a mere as merely the chemical formula H2O, but as the material stuff that actively informs our imagination, and that actively teaches us how to learn about purity and boundary dissolution, and how to learn about generativity and chaos, and so like going back to Catherine's point about like remembering, like looking at like what does it mean to be of the ages, and how to really how to see water in continual new ways that really help us to embody who we are as beings in this universe. I feel that there's just so much rich stuff that water can offer. Thank you.
Nancy, I believe you've got the culminating words.
I would only add to the earlier discussion of food that someone said that food is the most intimate act in relation to God, that I think that we're discovering, all of us, that it is in drinking as well, that we are in intimacy with God, and it's a new flowing, it's a new discovery. I mean, I'm not there yet, I'm just beginning, and so much appreciate my colleagues here for all of their work.
Likewise.
Thank you.
I want to just join in thanking again all our panelists here, and I want to close by picking up one insight that Nancy alluded us to, and that is the miraculous diversity of forms that water makes possible. If you get a chance, come by the table here at some point. I've been basking in the fragrance of these incredible lilies during this whole time here. There's another embodied sense of water coming to the fragrance of life that's just sort of bathing over us here. But thank you all so much.